while we wait for everybody to finish getting this down, I want to remind y'all that reflection paper 2 is due tonight, right? And then reflection paper 3 will be due next week, so next Thursday. Does anybody have any questions about any of those assignments? No? Okay. So, what I'd like y'all to do, first off, I want everybody to partner up with somebody. I think we're going to have like one group of 2 and one group of 3 because we've got odd numbers here. But yeah, everybody is going to need to partner up.
What do you say?
What's that?
What do you say?
Yeah, sure. However you guys want to do it, right? You can choose your own group. So yeah, if you guys want to be in a group, or if you guys want to be in a group, that's fine. Okay. So here is what I would like the problem I would like all of you to consider, right? So let's assume that you are in charge of a state with a perfectly even number of 1,000 citizens. $50 of those citizens are aristocrats, right? That is like traditional landowning nobility gentry, right? 350 of these citizens are professional elites. So, doctors, attorneys, business owners, educated professionals of various sorts, right? And the remaining 600 are common laborers of no particular skill or education or what have you, right? Now, you have had a particularly good harvest this year. And as such, you have 2,000 food units to distribute. So what I want each group to do is choose one of 3 ways to distribute those units on a couple of different dimensions, right? So the first method you could use is aristocracy, right? That is, assign food based on social class, right? The second you might choose is meritocracy, right? That is, assign who gets what amount of food based on how you perceive their usefulness to society, right? And the third equality. Everybody gets the same amount of food. Now, before you go too quickly deciding which of these systems you think is best for the exercise, right? I want you to make sure that you're considering it across 3 different dimensions as well, right? The first of those being the moral dimension, right? Which do you think is most right? The second being the economic dimension. What do you think would be most productive? And the third being political, right? What do you think would be the most feasible to enact, right? if you have to, if there are other people involved in making the decision, right, and indeed there are, because you're making this decision in groups, right, which would be the easiest sell? So take some time with this, ask me any questions if you have them. And yeah, just figure out how you would want to distribute these resources. And remember, you've got one thing too here. There's going to be no agreeing to disagree, right? Each group is going to have to come to consensus.
Do you want us to pick in terms of like which one you want us to pick 3 different answers?
Yes. I mean, and, it may be the same answer for all 3, right? You may choose the same answer for all 3. That's okay. But I want you to answer all 3 of these questions, right? And be able to provide a justification as well.
So you're saying you want us to answer which ones are the moral, economic split?
Yes.
Okay.
But you have to agree.
You're saying you think number 3. Or number 2.
Keep at it, I'll be right back.
Yeah, well, because it'd be hard to explain the logic.
Yeah, I don't think that it was this how giving it to the common person versus
Morally, I thought the quality might work too.
yeah. Definitely political to me.
Well, we could both agree that number 2. Politically, who's right politically? I was at first I thought the American Congress would be yeah,
You guys seem quiet. Come to an agreement?
So we figured out which one's the best.
Okay. You guys sound like you might still be talking it out. Okay. What's that? Okay.
more than your participants. Like you said.
Yeah, shoot.
When it's saying like spreading the food equally, does that mean equally to each individual person or equally to the class?
That would mean that everybody gets the same.
So every person is the same.
Yeah.
Because I was thinking like if you split it into higher and lower classes and it was just aristocrats and the professionals in one and common in one, and you gave them the equal amount of food, it would probably be the most fair. Because it's less people in the higher class, but they work slightly harder, so they would end up having the tiniest bit more.
Or at least some of them do, right?
Yeah.
Remember that aristocrats don't actually work, right? That's
Still number one. I think it's two still. I think possibly, common labor is like merchants. Professional common labor is what merchants. We're going to work on the farms.
Oh yeah,
Maybe they deserve as much food as everyone else. Possibly more. Maybe more. Or maybe it is meritocracy.
yeah. See, the issue with meritocracy is you have to define merit, right? By some standards of merit, different classes might be more deserving than others, right?
So maybe we should go on the farm.
So, take what you have already done, right? Take the thinking you've already done, and I want you to consider now a revision of the question, right? So, a generation on, the number of citizens you have has doubled. You have 1,200 common laborers. You have 700 professional elites and 100 aristocrats. However, the supply of food this being a bad harvest year is slightly less. Now how do you decide how to allocate these resources? So think about this and see if this changes your calculus in any way, right?
thousand
the
for
easiest way to do it.
validity.
The higher
Genetic
classes get
quality.
more.
That's a shortage.
Yeah. So it's kind of like before you move those two.
Yeah, the decision feels easier, right, when resources are plentiful, right, than when they're scarce. So how are we all doing here? Like, what have you all come up with so far? What was the scheme y'all came up with for plentiful resources?
For the first.
Yeah, the first one. Yeah.
The first one, we put, well, moral, we just put equality, so I guess the same thing.
Okay.
For,
Yeah. All human beings having equal rights to
Yeah.
sustenance, right? Okay.
For geographical, values, for the first one, we put meritocracy, the second one, because of, since the common laborers are going to be the ones working more, doing more of your manual labor and stuff like that, the common people are going to be going through, keep everything.
Okay.
going.
So you're putting the people at the bottom of the bottom of the socioeconomic pyramid first because they're the food producers.
First, genome.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
And then for, of course, for political, we put aristocratic and all that stuff. Because of the way government's split up, or higher section classes are going to get more food.
Okay. One thing to bear in mind with aristocrats too, though, right, is that what's the smallest group here?
Aristocrats.
So you would have to convince these other 900 people, right, or I guess 950 people in the first example, to go along with that scheme. Now, aristocrats usually had means of doing that, that were basically force, right? One of the things we were looking at last time we talked about Thomas Hobbes was that, right, the nobility, the aristocracy, basically had in his system of government, his ideal system of government, a monopoly on force, right? Ideally, so they can protect the lives and property of the people, but this also gives them the ability to impose their will on others. What about you guys? What did you guys come up with for the first example?
We had meritocracy for the first,
Okay, you
for the
think.
second, and then for the third one as well. And put that because we thought for the first, at least when the food was more plentiful, that morally it was more right to like spread the food to the people who needed it. Because if you're a worker, you're going to use more energy. You're doing
Okay.
more.
So you were
need
using
more.
a similar definition of meritocracy to them. Okay.
And then switch politically to equality. Like it would be easier to like politically explain
Yeah.
spreading the food equally
Sure.
rather than giving it. Because regardless if you choose one or the other, someone's going to get mad. So
Yeah. At least in a system where everyone gets a vote, right? That one might be the easier sell. Like meritocracy and equality would both definitely be easier sells than aristocracy in a system where everyone gets a vote, right? Now in a system where no one gets a vote, the easiest sell is probably aristocracy, right? Because they're the only ones making the decision. Now, did any of you did either group change their answers for the second example? Okay, what did you change your answers to and why?
We kept the moral one still at equality.
Uh-huh.
Try to distribute it as even as we can.
Yeah.
And then for the second one, we put it back to aristocratically, because of the food shortage. Anybody that's higher up socially will be more would be like, since they're higher up, they're more like in front of the line to get food.
Okay.
And still for political, for the third one, we kept the aristocratic.
Uh-huh. So yeah, it seems like you guys are kind of assuming here an order where the top class can pretty much tell the others what to do, right?
Yeah.
Okay. What about you guys? Did you change your answers?
Kept pretty much the same, but we changed the first to equality.
Okay. That the first becomes equality because with less food to go around, there needs to be shared sacrifice, basically. Okay. So, and yeah, what we've just kind of done here is like we've been trying to think about the problem here that Malthus is pointing out and is trying to solve, right? Well, solve in quotation marks here because I would argue that the solution he comes up with doesn't actually really involve doing much of anything. So, Malthus argues see if we can get this to cooperate with me. Stay. No, you're not. So Malthus argues that resources, food resources, increase arithmetically, right? That is by addition. So the sequence of increase would be something like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so on and so forth, right? However, population increases geometrically, right? That is by multiplication. So the sequence of increase would look more like 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, and so on and so forth, right? So what does this demonstrate? What principle is he trying to demonstrate here about the relationship between population and food resources?
Population grows faster.
Yeah, a lot faster, right? That population essentially doubles with every generation, unless there's something to put a check on it, right? While resources double in the first generation, but then increase much more slowly, right? So what this then leaves a state with, according to Malthus, is a large surplus population that does not have enough to feed itself. And that this proportion of the population is going to get larger with each successive generation, right? So Malthus is writing in the middle of and in response to 2 revolutions. One of them is an economic and productive revolution, and the other one is an actual political revolution. So the first one, historians refer to, and God, why won't this thing stay still? As the British Agricultural Revolution. Right. No violent overthrow of the social order here, right? This is kind of purely a revolution in farming techniques and land ownership practices, right? So this is, it starts in the mid-17th century and ends in the late 19th century. And what we have in this period is a rapid growth, an enormous growth in Britain's agricultural output. Right, so England and Wales in particular are just putting out tons more food than they had in previous generations. And this is for a couple of reasons. Right, most of which are specific innovations, some of which actually do also end up having bad social consequences. Right, one is a change in farming practices. Right, crop rotation is introduced as is selective breeding of livestock, particularly to encourage livestock breeds that are more productive, that produce more meat, that produce more milk, that produce more wool, and so on and so forth. Right? Does everybody know what crop rotation is? Okay, I figure down here most people are probably aware, but for those who might not know what crop rotation is, what is it? Yeah, go ahead.
One year you'll plant corn or something, have the first one, and the next year you'll do beans or something that just kind of helps nourish the soil.
Yeah, exactly. You plant different things in different seasons, right, in order to keep the soil fertile and productive rather than letting it lie fallow and thus, erode and lose some of its fertility, right? You also had new inventions like the seed drill, improved plows, and railroads. Right, railroads useful mostly for getting goods to and from market faster, right? The plows they started building didn't require as many oxen or horses to pull them, right? They were smaller and more efficient. Does everybody know what a seed drill is? Okay, what's a seed drill? Those who nodded.
Basically, pull the wheels kind of turn like a shaft that pokes holes in the ground.
Yeah.
Behind it drops seeds straight into the holes right after it goes in.
Right, where before you would just be tossing the seeds on the ground and hoping they sprout, right? Yeah, exactly. It gives the crop a better chance of surviving and gives you a better yield, right? There are all of these new inventions increasing farm productivity and efficiency. And what happens typically when you use new machines to increase efficiency? What do you then often need less of?
Workers.
You often need fewer workers, right? We can look, one of the big debates that we still have about labor in this country is about the fate of mine workers in Appalachia, right? Essentially what happens with mining, right? People talk a lot about environmental regulations, but where the jobs really started disappearing was in the 1980s when mining jobs became more automated and strip mining and blowing up mountains became the primary modes of looking for ore rather than sending people into pits, right? So anytime you introduce new machinery that makes a job faster or more efficient, you need less human labor. And the labor you need often has different skills from the labor that was lost, right? You need people who know how to work the machines rather than people who knew how to do things the old way. You also had the development of free markets, at least within Britain and among some of its allies, right? That you had, you were able to move goods freely around the country, at least, without having to worry about tolls or tariffs. large-scale land reclamation, right? Taking land that had been waste or wilderness and converting it for farming. Although we have now since learned, especially through things that are happening right now in Central America and South America, that oftentimes reclaiming wilderness has deleterious environmental consequences as well, right? And related to this, you had the enclosure of what used to be called village commons. Now I'm going to assume that most of you don't know what this means, so just by way of explanation, all right? If you lived in a 17th century village in England, odds are it would look something like this, right? There would be a bunch of cottages, and maybe one or two, a couple of public buildings, like a tavern, a church, right? A couple of tradespeople, and in the center of all this, you would have a village green or a village common. And this was land that everybody in the village had a right to use, right? So, you could do small-scale grazing of livestock on it if you had a couple sheep or if you had a cow, right? You could plant a small vegetable garden on it, like for subsistence. You'd never be able to plant enough to sell. But you want to stick some turnips in there, go for it. So, what started happening in the late 18th century is that landlords decided that this was an unproductive use of land, and so they started fencing in these village commons and either subdividing them for growing crops or using them for large-scale livestock grazing. So this previously commonly held land was now being used exclusively for agriculture, which also meant that a lot of these villages essentially disappeared, right? The villages broke up and people moved to cities where there were new industries developing, and if they were lucky-ish, found work in factories, right? Which often paid less and was more physically demanding and dangerous than what we used to doing at home. So this is the immediate economic context that Malthus is writing in, right? So before we get to talking about the other revolution that's hovering in the background here, let's spend a little bit of time with the text itself. So what did you guys think of this? Like, what did you guys think of Malthus's overall arguments? Were you able to figure out what it was he was arguing? Right. We've gone over the 394. We've gone over the basic principle, right, that he's using as the foundation of his arguments. But what is he actually arguing for or against?
It felt like to me that he was arguing for poverty.
Okay. What made what? Okay. Well, what?
He's not arguing but saying that it's like a cycle. That poverty keeps the population in check.
Yeah, okay. Can you point to a particular passage? See if you can find a particular quote where he seems to be making that argument.
Here it goes right here. On 397.
Okay, 397. And can you read that out for us, please, James?
Yeah.
Thanks.
The way in which these effects are produced seems to be this. We will suppose the means of subsistence in any country just equal to the easy support of its inhabitants. The constant effort towards population, which is found to act even in the most vicious societies, increases the number of people before the means of subsistence are increased. The food, therefore, which before supported 7 millions, must now be divided among 7 millions and a half or 8 millions. The poor consequently must live much worse, and many of them be reduced to severe distress. The number of laborers also being above the proportion of the work in the market, the price of the labor must tend toward a decrease, while the price of provisions would at the same time tend to rise. The laborer therefore must work harder to earn the same as he did before. During this season of distress, the discouragements to marriage and the difficulty of rearing a family are so great that population is at a stand. In the meantime, the cheapness of labor, the plenty of laborers, and the necessity of an increased industry amongst them urge cultivators to employ more labor upon their land, to turn up fresh soil, and to manure and improve more completely what is already in tillage, till ultimately the means of subsistence become in the same proportion to the population as at the period from which we set out. The situation of the laborer being then again tolerably comfortable, the restraints to the population are in some degree loosened, and the same retrograde and progressive movements with respect to happiness are repeated.
Okay, thank you, James. Yeah, so let's look at the cycle here that's described, right? So what happens when population grows too fast over Malthus? And who does it affect?
The workers, he says, about food shortages.
Yeah. So when food is scarce, right? Food, as Malthus seemed to assume, is going to get the least.
The people that don't have good jobs.
Yeah, the poor are the ones he assumes are going to go without, right? So he's assuming a social structure that is not going to provide for the poor, particularly if there isn't enough to go around, right? So his definition of meritocracy might thus be different from what a lot of us were operating with, right? So what happens then when the poor and the working classes don't get enough food, according to Malthus' cycle?
They work harder, but they also stop getting married and having children.
Yeah. They don't reproduce as fast, right? It slows down their cycle of reproduction. They don't have as many children. Population is brought into check again, right? Also, starvation probably does some of the damage. And perhaps despair. So, once there's enough food, things go back to the way they were and everything's hunky-dory again, right? Until, once again, inevitably, the population outstrips the amount of available food, right? So he seems to think that this is something that's always going to keep happening, right? That there is no cure for this. There's no way to make this stop. And again, to put some of this into perspective, so Malthus writes this in 1798. At the beginning of the 18th century, 1701, the population of England and Wales was 5.5 million people, roughly. By the year 1800, it had almost doubled to 9 million. And this is taking into account emigration to North America and to Australia, as well as the prosecution of a war against France. So there are some checks to population during this point, right? But nonetheless, over the course of the century in which Malthus is writing, yeah, the population of England and Wales does just about double, right? So we see him using this word vicious, a lot here. What do you think he means by vicious? Like, what do you usually mean when you say someone or something is vicious? If this is a word you even use.
Kind of like aggressive.
Okay, yeah, if we're talking about like a vicious dog, right? Yeah, we usually use it to mean unusually aggressive. Yeah. Aggressive, right? Mean, nasty for no reason. Right? Does that seem to be what Malthus means by it?
I think vicious, in his terms, it's like, not that term, but like the community is like, it's hard on people, like, you know, vicious to the community itself, like,
Uh-huh.
like, someone to explain that, just like, it's hard to make something in that community, basically.
Uh-huh. And I think that,
Are you saying almost like struggle?
Yeah, like it's a struggle to make something of your family.
okay. And yeah, he does seem to concede that life in a vicious state seems to be more difficult, right? Yeah. But he does mean something actually slightly more specific by it. Vicious, for Malthus, is the opposite of virtuous, right? As vice is the opposite of virtue. So a vicious community or a vicious person is one that does not behave virtuously. So if we're thinking in terms of the sorts of things that 18th century Anglican clergymen thought of as vice, right? So these would be places, maybe where gambling is rife, and the drinking of gin, and overly free and open sexual relations, and things like that, right? So I think it might, in order to figure out what Malthus regards as vicious, it might behoove us to think about what he regards as virtuous. Right. What does he seem to think is the best way for people to live? What does he keep harping on as like the best way to encourage morality, or like the most moral kind of social attachment? Or the most natural kind of social attachment? Yeah, he's talking about marriage, right? And does he think that putting off marriage is a good thing that encourages virtue? It decreases population, right? Because people who marry later typically don't have as many children. But he regards the natural state of human happiness, right? The natural state of human morality as early attachment to one woman, as he puts it. Which word? Early attachment. It's sometimes hard to write as the board is threatening to fall on me. So he regards early attachment to one woman as the natural state of human affairs and human happiness, right? So what else does this tell us about his basic assumptions about the world? Regarding who's responsible for population increase or decrease? Is he addressing his arguments of the behavior of women at all?
I
So, is he addressing his arguments here at all to women or even like discussing women's behavior? No, he's only really interested in how men behave, right? So when he talks about the natural state of man's happiness is early attachment to one woman, right, he is speaking strictly in terms of masculine behavior, right? So whether population increases or decreases, he seems to regard as entirely dependent on what men do. So that's kind of like one kind of like interesting little wrinkle in his argument here. So it's really only predicated on the behavior of one gender. And so if a man fails to attach himself to one woman early in life, this seems to be to Malthus' encouragement to vice, right? So given that the basis of his argument is so strictly mathematical, is there anything about this part of it that seems weird to you? Like, how is this different from the basis of his argument? I mean, he's basically rejecting something that could be a solution to his problem, right? If people just start marrying later and having fewer children, then population doesn't grow so damn fast, right?
He thinks marriage, early marriage is a deterrent to sexual relations?
Yeah, the fact that like that early marriage is deterrent to what he regards as vice, right? He seems to think of vice primarily, I think, in sexual terms. Oh, bloody hell. And everything goes wrong at once. Thank you, James. Oh, thanks. Yeah, vice for like has to do with sexuality and sexual morality, right? So to do anything about this problem, like encouraging late marriage, like legalizing birth control or abortion, would to him encourage sexual immorality and thus be unacceptable, right? So the only acceptable solution for Malthus is to basically let nature take its course, mostly among the poor. And just take a minute and think about this argument, right? And I want you to consider whether or not you think this argument to be reasonable. And why or why not it is reasonable. Why it is reasonable or why it isn't. I certainly have thoughts about it. I certainly have ideas, and I'm not going to, punish you if your ideas are different from mine, right? But I do just want you to think about the idea, consider it, and just, be willing to tell us what you think. Yeah, about whether it is or is not desirable to control population, what means are acceptable for accomplishing that, right? Yeah, the basic math of his argument is, as he says near the end of his essay, hard to argue with, right? But I think the other principles here are certainly much more debatable. I have no problem, by the way, telling you what I think, but I want to wait and hear what you think first.
I think that ultimately it's your choice, depending on what you use and stuff. But I think this
I'll be honest, I did not hear anything you were saying.
I said I think ultimately it's your choice whether you want to use birth control or abortion. But I think limiting people's ability to choose is a problem.
Okay. And does he seem to you to want to limit people's choices for good reasons? He knows what the consequence is going to be, right? He knows the consequence is going to be that population will then keep increasing, and unless there's a war or mass immigration or something to check it, people are going to starve, right? Well, so what do the rest of y'all think?
Is this like our feelings or our interpretation on his?
I want you to comment on Malthus's, like, how do you feel about his ideas? So yeah, these are your feelings, but I'm asking you your feelings and your feelings about Malthus's argument. I know, it's not normal for a professor to ask me how you feel about something, right? I mean, I guess I'll just go ahead and say, like, I do actually find something morally revolting, personally, about Malthus's arguments. That he's willing, from my perspective, to condemn thousands or perhaps millions of people to starvation over his own sexual principles, right? That to me seems like a bridge too far. Whatever anyone thinks of the morality of birth control or abortion, right? To point out a potential solution to a problem you've identified and then reject it because you feel it might make people a little bit too loosey-goosey in their behavior, right? That seems to me morally indefensible. However, it might be time to bring in the other little bit of context here that's been lurking in the background. So there's another revolution that happens about a decade before Malthus writes this essay in a country that neighbors England. Anybody know what I'm talking about?
French?
Yeah, the French Revolution, which is actually still ongoing in 1798. Right? It starts in 1789. And is ongoing in some form until about 1804. All right, so what do y'all know about the French Revolution, if anything?
So like the guillotine came into play and started like getting major officials and chopping their head off in front of everybody.
Yeah, the enduring image we have of it is the guillotine, right? And all of these public beheadings, particularly of French aristocrats and people who were perceived as their allies, right? So yeah, we remember the guillotine. Anything else that y'all know about the French Revolution?
In my older history class, he kind of taught us that it was like encouraged by us, or we kind of encouraged it because whenever we revolted, they felt like they could do the same.
Oh, sure. Well, yeah, and the Marquis de Lafayette, who was involved in the French Revolution, also had first come over here to fight in ours. It was also partially French spending on our revolution that indirectly caused theirs because they went broke helping us. And really, the French king wasn't helping us because he loved liberty. He was helping us because that hurt England, right? And that was his big geopolitical rival. But in doing so, he bankrupted the country. So the French Revolution was primarily about the overthrow of the aristocracy, right? And the Catholic Church in France. Right? The basic idea being that these two institutions had been making all the decisions and gobbling up all the resources and leaving the people with nothing. Right? One of the catalyzing incidents, for example, there's a famine. People in the city of Paris don't have enough to eat, so they march several miles to the king's palace at Versailles. They find out that his bakeries are full of bread that's just sitting there, right? More bread than he or his family will ever be able to consume. And so they take the king and queen prisoner and drag them back to Paris in chains, right? Then a couple of years later, they will execute both the king and the queen. But yeah, the really violent side of the French Revolution doesn't come along until a few years later. But by that time, by the time Malthus is writing this in 1798, yeah, this has descended into violence. And aristocrats are being dragged into dragged to the block and beheaded. And this has a profound impact on a lot of people in England, particularly a lot of people with more conservative politics, who favor the traditional ordering of society, right? And so I think one of the things kind of lurking in the back of Malthus's argument is what happens when you give the poor too much free rein. And they're starving, right? What might they do if there are too many of them? And there's no way to check or control their numbers, right? So poverty itself then becomes, for Malthus, a kind of natural check on population. Which occurs basically every time the number of people outstrips the amount of food. Where are we for time, by the way? Okay, 1:30?
1:30.
So, I think we more or less get this, right? We understand the basic arguments, we understand the context. And one thing I want y'all thinking about as you're working on the reflection papers and thinking about the larger paper you're going to write in a couple weeks, right, is that by and large, all of the things we've been reading, right, have been about how people in society ought to relate to each other. So I want you to try to, maybe think about and look for that particular common thread as you're thinking about all of these together, right? Now, when we look at Rachel Carson next time, Carson is thinking less about how we relate to each other and more about how we relate to our environment. That's really all I have for y'all today. Does anybody have any questions? All right, we good? All right, have a good weekend, everybody.